Is Frank Abagnale, the guy from Catch Me If You Can, the greatest con man of all time? Find out in my new series, Is It a Scam Storytime Yet? Catch Me If You Can is based on Frank's autobiography, and if you haven't seen it, he's played by the only a tiny bit hotter Leonardo DiCaprio. He's a charming young guy who cons his way around the country pretending to be a pilot, a doctor, and a college professor, and he's well liked by everybody except the pesky old FBI, as portrayed by Thomas the Hank Engine. What makes Frank's story so great isn't that he forged a pilot's license or successfully did surgery without training, or even that he passed $2.5 million in bad checks. What makes it so great is that he didn't. He made it all up. The movie should have been called How Did You Not See That Coming? See, being a criminal is really difficult and stressful because crime is illegal, but going on TV and just saying you've done lots of crimes is much less stressful. And you might think lying on TV is risky because some people might figure it out. And they did, literally the day after. And not only did that not stop his career, it didn't even stop him from getting rebooked on that show 2 more times. He even got hired as a security consultant by law enforcement using a completely made up resume, and I assume his first lesson was how to actually research resumes. And I'm not saying he was a good dude. Of course he wasn't. The reason we know he wasn't flying around on Pan Am Airlines all the time is because that time period he was in jail for stealing from his friend's parents. And that's why he's the perfect con man, because when you learn about it, it reminds you that there are not glamorous crime gentlemen like in the movies. There are just people who steal shit because they can't hold jobs. His most impressive con wasn't pretending to be an airline pilot. It was convincing the entire world he was a likable dude. The Ponzi scheme. Was it named after the first to do it, the best to do it, or just some guy? Find out on another episode of Is It a Historical Scam Yet? A Ponzi scheme is where you pay investors with money from other investors. It's like a pyramid scheme, but you don't make your victims recruit other victims. So there's not an obvious shape to name it after. That dishonor went to Carlo Pietro Giovanni Guglielmo Tebaldo Ponzi. He went by Charles. He started as a petty criminal, but eventually got a job at a crooked bank that was doing an other version of the Ponzi scheme. So he stole his idea for a scam from a different con man, which is classic Ponzi. Later, he went to jail for forging checks, but instead of telling his mom that he was in trouble, he wrote her a letter saying that he had gotten a job as a special assistant to the warden. Classic Ponzi. But his big break came when he figured out a very complicated way to make a very small amount of money using coupons for international stamps. But since actually doing it was too much work, instead he just told people he had done it and it was working really well and they should invest in his weird stamp fraud company. Then he used other investors to pay off those investors, and he kept going and going till he Ponzi'd too close to the sun and it blew up, which is what always happens with a Ponzi scheme. And then he had to go spend some more time working as the special assistant to the jail warden. In the end, he lost investors the equivalent of $300 million in today's money and caused the collapse of 6 banks. It wasn't the biggest. Bernie Madoff stole many times as much money, and it wasn't the first. One of the earliest modern Ponzi schemes was in Germany by a woman named Adele Spitzer, and Charles Dickens wrote about another early scammer in his novel, Martin Chuzzlewit. And Ponzi is just a more fun name to say than Spitzer or the Chuzzlewit scheme. Plus, I think stealing the name from people who deserve it more is classic Ponzi. The Wolf of Wall Street is a movie about financial crimes, but was it made using an even bigger financial crime? Find out in another episode of my hit series, Is It a Scam Storytime? Yep. Wolf is about Jordan Belfort, a guy with a very high neck-to-head ratio, who went to jail for a bunch of pump-and-dump stock scams and now is a grind-set public speaker and an investor in crypto. Obviously. Like Catch Me If You Can, it came from the autobiography of a con man, so you should take all of the good parts and some of the bad parts with a grain of salt. He stole hundreds of millions of dollars from his clients and has only had to pay a tiny fraction of that back, and his jail sentence was significantly reduced because he ratted on his partners and his underlings. And that's awful, but by far his worst crime is it turns out he gave himself the nickname the Wolf of Wall Street. When I learned that, I cringed so hard I thought I broke a rib. But the craziest part of the whole story is that all the money for the film was stolen from the government of Malaysia. It was part of the 1MDB scandal, which has very little to do with movies, even though it looks exactly like IMDb. It's one of the biggest white-collar crimes of all time. A guy whose name is not pronounced YOLO, but looks like it could be, convinced the Malaysian government to create a $4.5 billion investment fund and put him in charge. And then he took it. A guy almost named YOLO took $4.5 billion from a country, and he gave $100 million of it to Martin Scorsese to make a very long movie based on a con man's fanfic of himself. And he still hasn't been caught. He's been on the run for almost a decade, and my main takeaway from this movie is you don't have to. Turn yourself in, rat on your employees, and you'll get a lucrative public speaking career, and Leo DiCaprio will play you in the movie. Every scam that seems new isn't actually. Like last week when a company valued at over $1 billion imploded because they said they were using AI to build apps, and it turns out they were using people. Criminal? Funny? Yes. Criminal? Possibly. New? Not really. Is it time for a history lesson? Yep. Builder.ai was founded by a guy who referred to himself as the chief wizard and voluntarily paid money for this shirt, put it over his human body, and went out in public. So we should have known something was up, but he wasn't the first person to pass off a group of underpaid people as AI. This AI store was people. This AI e-commerce company was people. This AI translation service, just people. Elon Musk's autonomous robots, driven by people. And that was 8 years after he made a video supposedly showing off self-driving cars, and they were driven by, you guessed it, people. There are all these movies about robots pretending to be people, but so far real life is much more about people pretending to be robots. And all of those scams owe something to the granddaddy it's just people scam, the Mechanical Turk. Built in the 1700s, it was a life-size chess-playing robot, and the Turk traveled around the world beating chess masters and celebrities like Ben Franklin and Napoleon Bonaparte. And obviously I ruined the surprise, but it was just people. Under the chessboard was a big box, and it looked like it had a bunch of gears and clockwork and stuff in it, but actually that was all just hiding a dude. That trick fooled people for 80 years, or more accurately, is still fooling people 250 years later. One of these days, robots probably will take our jobs, but in the meantime, there are business people who are so excited about robots taking our jobs that they're willing to pay people to pretend to be those robots. And there isn't a surefire way to tell somebody is so morally bankrupt they're willing to commit robot job fraud, but there are signs. Look, I also wish animals could talk, although I am worried that some of them would have abhorrent politics, but all talking animal scams owe a debt to the original talking animal scam, a very clever horse named Hans. Hans lived in Berlin in the late 1800s, and it really seemed like he could do math. He'd be brought out on stage, and someone would be like, hey, horse, they loves it when you say, hey, horse, what's 9 plus 2? And then he would tap his hoof 11 times. He'd be like, 1, 2, 3, up to 11, and everybody like, wow, he really knew the answer. This is a very clever Hans. That is a very good trick, but an interesting thing is that while it certainly is a trick, nobody involved has to be in on the trick. The trainer, the audience, the person asking the question, and Hans, none of them have to know what's happening. It is a rare quadruple blind scam. Here's how it worked. Hans was a people pleaser, and when you stopped talking, he knew it was his turn to start clapping. And he also knew that when you smiled, we did that little thing with your eye that indicated you were happy with him, he must have gotten to the right number, and then he would stop clapping. And that's a trick, and he doesn't know math, but still, that's a very clever Hans. This is basically the same trick with chimps who seem like they can speak sign language, and dogs who press a series of buttons to say, when it is cloudy out, I feel a deep sense of ennui, although both of those include the less impressive trick of selective editing. And the clever Hans effect is a way that cops can introduce their own biases to drug-sniffing dogs, so ACAB includes canines. After people caught on to the trick, Hans stopped performing, and then he just kind of floated around until he got drafted into World War I by Germany, because if animals could talk, you probably wouldn't like their politics.